heard of Raimundo Panikkar. Raimundo Panikkar has a strange history. He is his mother is Spanish. His father is Malayali, and during the I think First World War or the Second World War, his father moves as an Air Force pilot to London and meets his mother, and they get married. Raimundo Panikkar is part of the Roman Catholic Church. In fact, he is the founder, one of the founder members of the Opus Dei. Raimundo Panikkar, in his journey like a good Indian, which happens, gets completely disillusioned. And then he starts writing stuff. Amongst them, a lot of it is on translation of the Vedas, including Veda Manjari. And I think writes one of the most profound sort of articles in a UNESCO-published journal called Diogenes, which said, "Is the notion of human rights a Western concept?" That's a profound article. It's path-breaking. Any one of, I was originally interested in cultural relativism. So most of the Islamists actually, rely on that article. That article lays the foundation of what in broader, in legal academia is called legal pluralism. I don't know, you've heard of all that we are discussing is actually legal pluralism. So it's the foundational document of legal pluralism. So he writes that. He's excommunicated from the church immediately. And he also writes Veda Manjari, in which he says, he comes back to India and he says basically to the church that Jesus Christ may not be the only savior, and there may be other ways to reach God than Jesus Christ. He's excommunicated. He settles in America, in the University of Santa Barbara, writes, and then finally retires and dies in Spain. But he's greatly quoted. He's a wonderful, wonderful author. I would recommend all of you to read that, because the interesting thing about Raimundo Panikkar is Raimundo Panikkar exists in both worlds. Raimundo Panikkar is a Latin scholar, obviously very highly placed within the church, so he comes from that background. And he's a deep Sanskrit scholar. And basically translates a lot of, and Raimundo Panikkar writes on that question, which I think, which we all grapple with today, is to basically the entire conception of rights, entire conception of a structure, westernized structure, which is predicated on assertion of rights, and entire question of whether it is westernized at all. There are two wonderful books. One is by Alistair McIntyre called After Virtue. And the most interesting insight of Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue is on the question of rights, any rights, and not only human rights. Alistair McIntyre in After Virtue says there is no word for rights in Japan before the 19th century. So, and I tried to, when I read it, and I tried to apply it in India, that's true. We approximate a lot of words because we exist in the world that we are, but there is no. And there's another wonderful, there's a wonderful article which I would recommend reading. It's called Why the Buddha Has No Rights. So, and when we talk about reading Indic stuff, my interesting and my take on it is we should not only concentrate on, and this is a division which we have in our heads, so we have to be careful in doing that, not only concentrate on reading, for better or for worse, the words which and I know that I'm using a shorthand, but just to be clear, I have to put in a lot of caveats here. Sanatani texts, but we also have to, or we have to read, again I'm using a shorthand word for you, Buddhist texts as well. Manusmriti is a case in point. Manusmriti, we read it in a certain way, and I don't think we read it universally in that way. I think regions of India read Smritis differently. In the East, we read Smritis differently than what we read in North and South and even in Kerala. So there are different ways to read it. But the most interesting take on it is the Burmese Buddhists rely on what they call Dhammatat for their customary law. And they have a completely different conception of Manusmriti. What is the basis of Manusmriti? We know the history, which we usually read, that there was complete chaos, so Indra wanted to give a king to the world, so Manu was made the king, and Manu then themselves, and that entire history. While the Buddhists have a different take on it. Buddhists said that the first king of the world was Mahasammata. So there was a consensual sort of way of dealing with it. The Buddhists did not, and irrespective of what we say today, the Buddhists, I'm sure all of you know, because all of you are quite aware of this subject, they did not disclaim, there was no disclaiming of the heritage of the broader Indic perspective, Indic laws, but they brought within themselves what is called a Buddhist ethic, how to interpret it. And I think if we today talk about a Bharati perspective, I think I'm a little bit of a Swami Vivekananda take on it. I think to lend heart to that perspective, and not only the mind, you need a Buddhist perspective as well. I think, and I'm going to call it out for what it is before I start on my structural. The Indic, and I'm using a word, and don't get me wrong, but that's how Southeast Asia Sanatan Dharma is called. They call Brahmanism. You know that in Southeast Asia, those who follow Sanatana are called Brahman Dharma and Bodh Dharma, and that's how it's distinct. The Brahman Dharma perspective of it is institutional, and in many ways very structured. We like to talk about equity, but I think if you add the Buddhist perspective in it, because that was a valid perspective, then gives it much more a rounded, it gives it heart. Like there is, again, I would suggest a wonderful book about how the Buddhist Sangha practiced democracy and what was the nature of democracy in the Buddhist Sangha, how was it actually practiced. These were all regulated rules which were clearly, because there were monasteries in which decisions were taken. So, that also needs to be taken into account, especially the Buddhist concern for the weak and people who are not empowered. Because the downside of, I'm using a shorthand word and not in the way, a Sanatani, strictly orthodox Sanatani perspective is, it becomes structural, and in some ways it can be used for oppression. And I don't want to use a Marxist term, but that's the criticism of the Buddhists from day one. So it's not only about neo-Buddhist sort of criticism, but that's a criticism. That's what the Buddha said. So I'm not, because the Buddha describes who is a Brahmin. And then the most wonderful part is, I don't know whether you've read Dhammapad. There is a huge tract where he describes who is a Brahmin. And that's where, in many ways, that's the common thing with, where he says it's about the attributes the person has and it's not about where he's born. So in many ways, the sort of interpretation which we have today, it's about what his attributes and not where he's born, comes from, the Buddha says that in the Dhammapad. Now, all that being said, we need to study it, and we need to study, I would say, a lot what happened in Southeast Asia. One of the greatest Western scholars who wrote on Indic thinking is a person called Robert Lingat, who wrote a book which is very famously quoted, which was quoted in the Ram Janmabhoomi matter also, called Classical Law of India, which I think is the best. It's a thin book, published by Oxford, also Motilal Banarsi Das publishes it. Robert Lingat originally comes into Sanskrit from reading the literature of dharma in Southeast Asia, in the Thai court, because he's French. And from there he gets interested into Indian classical jurisprudence, and he writes on that. So I'm saying that if you sort of want to get an idea, don't look only into India. The Tibetans had a wonderful way of dealing with it. The Thais had a wonderful way of dealing with it. The Burmese still have a way of dealing with it. And as I said controversially, the Indonesians had a wonderful way of dealing with it. So if you're looking for this, I think it requires, and I would suggest that it's a wonderful way, besides the structures, is to read how Adat law has been used in Indonesia. Because the difference in the way the British approached customary practice, or what was called customary practice, prevalent in society, and how to translate that in law, the Dutch faced the same problem in Indonesia. Indonesia is a recently Muslim society. It converted in 1500s, so very recently. But so the practices were still deeply Hindu in many ways, though it's now strongly challenged by increasingly strong group. But in India, the British preferred codification and statification of law. The state sort of took over that, and they interpreted customary law, made it codified, and they applied it. So customary law was made into a code, while the Dutch kept state law as it is, but they also sort of supported the traditionalists against the modernists. So the politics of it was that the English supported the modernists against the traditionalists after a point of time, saying that, you know, that entire debate about Macaulay, that, everything is bad, everything is bad, everything is bad, everything is bad. The Dutch adopted, because of, again, the politics of Indonesia, they supported the traditionalists against the modernists. So Adat law was given a higher stature. So today, even today, customary land holdings, interrelationships, etc., are governed by communitarian Adat law. Adat is practice. So they have that wonderful saying in Indonesia, ki, the Sharia comes from whatever comes from the Sharia and from Muslim sources, from Deen comes from the Sharia, wisdoms comes from the sages, which is this Hindu thing, and practice comes from Adat, which is customary from the people. So the Indonesian state accepts that, because that was the Dutch heritage in it. Now coming to India, that being the background, there are lots more to say on it, and it's very, very interesting, but coming to India, I would say that Indian state has dealt with these conceptions in two different ways. And I'll address the structure first. It's dealt with it conceptually in a different way. It's structurally in a different way. Dharma, as we all discussed, dharma is in many ways, the implementation of dharma has largely been social in this country. I'm not describing you, every person has their swadharma. There is apadharma. You can follow different dharmas at any point of time, multiple dharmas, and I'm doing the shorthand because I'm sure all of this has been discussed, and it seems very literate, so I don't have to go into details on this. Danda is not a punishment, but it is to get you to, if you have a fall from dharma, is to get you back on the path of dharma. Now, the sanction mostly, if you read, is largely social. And because it is social, it is difficult to have records of that. It is extremely relative and social. The British adopted a shorthand by treating the Smritis as codes. It still exists today in interpretation. The Smritis, to my understanding, whether it be Manav Dharma Shastra or whether it be Apastamba or Yagnavalkya, subject to correction, was not meant to be strictly read as a code, as in codification in terms of codification. Again, that's another long debate where I can have a huge debate whether codification means that you lay down the law line by line. Anything which goes against it is incorrect, and that comes from a very Roman perspective from the time of Justinian. Romans used to follow our system. But that was codified when Justinian came onto this huge empire, sort of through various different people, and then he came out with this concept of jus civile, whereby he wanted to have a common law which will be applicable across the board on various different people. The British also did that. Therefore, they came up with the Indian Penal Code, which they applied across the British Empire, which was codification of British common law, Contract Act, everything the British came out with. To codify, makes it simple. So people who are not from your culture can be governed by that. It was Roman, but Roman approach to it. But the Dharma Smritis are not codes. They're extremely, and we have forgotten that it's possible, because in our software, in our hardware, we cannot believe a justice can be achieved without a code. So we first have to, sort of decolonize ourselves. I'm not saying good, bad, but it's a social sanction. And I know, large number of dharma. In the end, there's a dharma, even of sadachara comes dharma. So there are various sort of ways to read dharma in actual implementation. And, wise men, individuals, even your own chitta can be a best guide of dharma. So there is a way of decision making, but we have to be able to internalize that to that decision making process, which is completely contrary to the Western method of decision making, of judicial decision making. So I think that's a big problem. Structurally, that's been a big problem. I don't know how many of you know that even the Hindu law that we know today is Anglo-Hindu law. It's not Hindu law. Because the British, when they started implementing common law on India, would sit with Brahmin Pandits on one side and Maulvis on the other. And the problem they faced at that point of time is because precisely the Brahmin Pandits would use the Dharma Shastras as a manual, like it's supposed to be, as an indicator of possible actions. And they would then sit and justify everything. So the British judges at that point, and this is genuinely a fact, you read the history of it, they genuinely felt that they were being taken for a ride. Well, ये तो कुछ भी justify कर देते हैं. Well, it's like convenient, because they were not used to that. So they therefore got all of this translated. There was a translation made of Hindu law. There was a translation made of Muslim law. So the Fatwa-e-Alamgiri, which still is the sort of the document on which most of Islamic interpretations of law happens in India, was actually translated at that point of time. There was a huge resentment, outcry, especially as to Muslim law, and then they published it as some perceptions of Muslim law, sort of like it's an anglicized word. But for us, most of the codes of Hindus were actually translated. So at that point of time and implemented as codes. Because the British attempted to do that, didn't happen. But, that's all inherent in the law. This comes with all the baggage. So you have to our conceptions of property are different. Our conceptions of beings are different. Our conceptions of a lot of things are different. And and therefore this entire conception of justice is different. That discussion which you had is whether there is systemic flaw and whether it's systemically the adversarial system is perfect. You know for a fact that Mahatma Gandhi said two things in Hind Swaraj. And two or three things, but two of the most prominent things which he said is, one, shut down on all hospitals, and the other is shut down all courts. He also said shut down education institutions, shut down trains. And my father was a FRCS doctor, So he's a Bengali, so not too much of a Gandhian. So when I showed him the book, he was shocked. He said, yes, it confirms all my biases about Gandhi, because he was a complete modernist, 50s, 60s modernist. And like a good Bengali, the default is anti-Gandhian. Subhash Bose and things of that sort. But Gandhi said that problems of India you cannot solve by this present justice system. He asked people to boycott it. His version was, he said two things, which is now being very quoted for educational purposes, where they said that you cannot solve the problems of India by following the school system which you are doing. You have to have a school which sort of goes, which basically takes it to the people. And he said the same thing about the courts. Dharmapal, I don't know how many of you know Dharmapal. Have you read Dharmapal? Dharmapal makes that point about education system, saying that there was great amount of education in, except through. So I'm sure that is same for the courts. I think even today, and I'm going to come back on topic, 70% of India lives in villages. Okay? Still. I think there may be more urbanization, but it's large numbers still lives in villages. In villages, as you are right, decisions are still made by customary law, by customary judicial institutions. You can call them panchayats, you can call them khap panchayats, you can call them whatever you want to. In Kolkata, in West Bengal, they call it shalishi. But it's approximately the same thing. If there's a dispute in village today, even today, people don't go to the court. It's not about distance. People don't trust the courts. Yeah. The courts are still large parts of India, is a foreign institution. Courts are an imposition, and courts are not trusted. As there is more urbanization, there are more profusion of lawyers, that's a separate issue, but the courts are not trusted. So today, even to my understanding, most of the decision making in India is still through customary processes, not recognized by the state. But the state has also, at its own level, that's a great contradiction of the Indian state, recognizes this. And so therefore it comes up with Nyaya Panchayats, and which it uses modernist state logic, whereby adopts it to the political process and makes it as a part of the state. Dehorse is a legal word, but separate from the society. So you now create a traditional dispute-making process, which is a political dispute-making, for the want of a better word, not a social. So which doesn't have social support, but which has political support, which works out worse. Because if the villagers really have to trust someone, they might as well go to the courts and not go to Nyaya Panchayat. So even if and we are all, irrespective of whether we sit in this wonderful auditorium, in spite of the fact that we had these wonderful trainings at IITs, and I have had a training at the National Law School, which is as left of center school as you can possibly get. We are all, at the end of the day, we are all Bharatiya. So you can put in whatever software you want to, but your hardware is what it is. I think any one of you who've traveled the world and who've been in academia, especially in these issues, you realize it very clearly. In the beginning, you think that it's like we have this very famous poet in Bengali called Michael Madhusudan Dotto, you might have heard. He wrote great poems and he thought he was going to be the greatest poet after Shelley. And then he got completely rejected. And then he does a full 180-degree turn and becomes one of the greatest poets of Bengali literature. And he writes in like hardcore Sanskrit, as in like Sanskritized Bengali. That's where it all comes from. So you realize that your software is completely different. The solutions which you come up with are uniquely from an Indic perspective. And even if you may frame it, you frame it in Indic terms. Now, but though you may articulate it in English and Western terms, but there are two or three things. In relation to the courts today, I still don't think they reach majority of people in India. The courts don't deliver for the majority of people in India. The courts are still in some ways colonial, because the courts are still in the colonial towns on which they were established. You know, all of us know that. It's still in, the biggest courts are still in Allahabad, in Patna, in Kolkata, in Madras, in Bombay, in Delhi. How more colonial can you ever be? So, and the grassroots level, you've adopted you know what the problem is. The Indian state obviously clearly knows what the problem is. Therefore, it tries to fix it with these Nyaya Panchayat type of solutions. But it cannot, but it does a very strange thing. It actually tries to stigmatize these social institutions, which still decides. Maybe it has to do with legitimacy, all of you will, legitimacy of the Indian state. And because it's very difficult to accept that you don't govern the people whom you and your own people don't trust you. It's very difficult for a state to accept that. So it tries to do that. How much of it succeeds, I don't know. On a conceptual level, as I said, the court, the state gets it. And I think it's possible to, if you tell me today, and before I was AG, the Advocate General of a state called Nagaland. Before I went to Nagaland, if you told me this question, if you put this question to me, saying that, Gandhi was for the past, the world has changed, you can't, that's gone. Wonderful ideas, but ho nahi sakta, ye sab badal chuka hai. You can't go back home. After I went to Nagaland, I am of the view that it's possible. Nagaland is no doubt a small state, but most of the decision-making process in Nagaland, as anyone would know, is through a formalized justice system which works through what is called, they have their own system, but it's called tribal and village decision-making councils. And except for the two main colonial towns of Dimapur and Kohima, which are like, the Indian state is enforcing it, so no, there has to be district courts in every small district headquarter. The Indian state is pushing its justice system as much as it can, but most of the decision making is still done, and done very efficiently. So much so, I have had a discussion with a district judge in Longleng, which is borders Burma. And she was there, so I asked her, to karte kya hai, what do you do for the entire day? I said, sir, we don't have any case. So in the morning I go to court, I come back. Why? Because Nagaland was left untouched because of various reasons. And it managed to have the decision-making process, which is now formalized. Because it came into the process late. I don't know how many of you know, Nagaland has a unique constitutional provisional protection under 371A, which they are very proud of. Everything, any dispute in Nagaland finally ends up in 371A, which is basically, that touches on entire creation of the state and that agreement which they have with the Indian state in 1948, I think, or 1963, when finally the Naga insurgency ends, they get a 371A. So that's enshrined. All this dispute is taken under the guise of customary law and is resolved. Mahatma Gandhi made an experiment, and he ran a state on those principles, called I don't know how many of you know, called the Aund experiment. He actually ran it. They ran that state for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years maybe. They ran it. I think Henry Kallenbach, they were all involved in it. They ran this state for 5 years. Aund is a small state of Maharashtra. Gandhi sort of supported this constitution which they framed. The Gandhians at the time of formation of the Indian constitution tried to circulate that, said this is also possible. But most of the legislators were completely modernist, and at least the leadership was completely modernist. The leadership said, bakwas, ek do baar. But it was in circulation. And this is across ideology, and they were all modernist. So when the Indian constitution, when it was framed, according to my understanding, it is not that in a vacuum. It is not that the Indian constitution was framed. There was a lot of struggle which went into formation of the Indian constitution. So it's not like it was framed off the bat in 1950. It's largely based on 1935 Government of India Act. And it's a shorthand for a lot of us to say, oh, 1935, the British did it, so, it's colonial in nature. That's not actually true, because there was, from 1857, we actively sort of wanted these changes, and these changes came slowly by Government of India Acts. One thing is very easy for us, a lot of us, and because that runs through the entire undercurrent of the Indian nationalist struggle, is that whole question of who are we? What is the nation that we have as a people? 1857 onwards, I think there was a consensus amongst the Indian elites that we want a modern state. So the problem is not from 1950. The issue was in 1857, when, after 1857, the old India died. Let me put it this way, that the last throw of the dice of the old India was 1857. And modernism won. The British used telegram, they used everything, the machines. The British slammed the old India. It was closed, but they finished the old India after that point of time. After that, the old India, Maharajas, the princes, they never had a say in Indian politics after 1857. It was over. Because the people after 1857 took a conscious decision that we want a modernist state, our politics should be modern. The ground shifted from underneath. There was no rebellion after 1857. Where was any rebellion after 1857? The rebellions happened, it was people's-based rebellion. Then it happened Congress, and it's not that protest and rebellion against the British government died down. But the grammar of it changed, because the Indian elite clearly decided was, in logo se, and that wonderful Mangal Pandey where, not wonderful Mangal Pandey, but in that Mangal Pandey where Amir Khan says, Sikka chalega to sirf iska, whatever, Bahadur Shah, magar hum chalayenge desh. But I think that happened later, because if you read Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's Anand Math, and you see how he ends, I don't know how many of you read Anand Math? It's a wonderful way wonderful or what in his take. So the struggle happens, and they defeat a coalition of Muslim princes and British, and he defeats them. And he says, the protagonist says that I want to continue this battle. And his guru says, no, you come. So I want to establish Dharma Rajya and all that. He said, no, battle is over, you come. He said, but then will we rule now? So he asked his guru, what do you foresee? You know everything. So the guru said, no, you won't rule now. The British will rule. So he said, what do you mean? I have fought so much. We've sacrificed so much. How do you mean the British will rule? He said, you have, by concentrating on your spiritual development, you have disregarded physical sciences. And there is no one but the British who can educate the people in physical science, because they're very good in education and physical sciences. They'll bring all that back. And then he said, then what will happen? He said, the moment you get that knowledge, you will get independence. So there was a very, and I'm saying that was across the board. That was and I know there was this discussion, which is not only to Bankim Chandra, this was happening across the board, even in Kerala, even everywhere. This was being discussed. It was a conscious decision that we wanted a modernist state. So your conclusion that you wanted in 47, in 50, was that you wanted a modernist state. And today, what we operate under, in spite of this entire conception, the development, whatever we've had, is under a modernist state. You have this wonderful standing army because you're a modernist state. You have this IIT because you're on a modernist state. So let us not disregard the fact of the benefits of the modernist state which is given us. So irrespective of our issues as to whether the constitution comes from the people, I don't think it comes too much. There are too many Indic ideas into the constitution. But that's a conscious decision that we sort of exercised at that point of time. And the way I look at it is, when we look at dharma, I'm sure there are better people, we say dharma is sthan, kal, patra, whoever, that depends on time. So we sort of took the constitution as a method of framing a modernist state in old civilization, as kala dharma, the dharma of the times that we lived in. It would have been perfect sometime, but this is the thing that we want. Conceptually, the Indian state has always grappled with these issues, and don't only go by the text of the constitution. One of the great things of the Indian state is, again, the conception of jati, which is the hidden undercurrent of this constitution, of this society. Everybody confronts it. Swami Vivekananda confronts it. Everybody confronts it. This is an issue which the Indian state, if you see the constitution in the beginning, completely disregards it, except for sort of making untouchability illegal, has no recognition of that. It is only in 89, after the Mandal Commission, when the Supreme Court equates class with caste in India, that is where some sort of recognition comes. It's a liberal constitution. It's a liberal democratic. Baba Saheb Ambedkar was a liberal, completely liberal Democrat. Was as liberal Democrat as you can get, irrespective of what his followers now make him out to be. In many ways, he had deep knowledge. Anyone who makes a mistake, he had deep knowledge of Indian text. And he had very clearly he had deep knowledge. Anyone who reads his writings knows that. Whether you agree with his interpretation or not, but he had deep knowledge. And he was a liberal Democrat, and he wanted a liberal democratic constitution. In fact, a liberal democratic constitution which was far ahead of his times. He was influenced by John Dewey, who was from the Columbia University, and therefore those reservation provisions were brought in. But even then, he's not the person who said it should go on, reservation should go on indefinitely. He said 10 years is enough. Because that was the take on it. He was a liberal Democrat, irrespective of what his followers now make him out to be. But he was a liberal Democrat. But we chose a liberal democratic constitution. So most of our Indic values, I think if you look at in fundamental rights, there is one place where in sort of, or two places. In Article 25, we recognize who is a Hindu as a qualification and making social and making religious institutions, throwing it open to everybody. In Article 26, we sort of recognize religious sects within religions to follow their own customs. That's unusual because that's not sort of exists anywhere else. We have certain provisions in the directive principles of state policy which is unimplementable. One is Gandhi's conception of trusteeship is sort of encapsulated in one of the provisions of 39. The other one is, I think, 40 or 42, which talks about protection of in animal husbandry of cows and also promotion of panchayat system. So you have trusteeship, you have panchayat system, and you have cows. So that's effectively what the Liberal Democrats actually thought the Indic system had to offer governance of India. But that's a conscious choice across the political parties. So Shyam Prasad Mukherjee had no point of time, would have thought anything different, irrespective of whatever we like to think. And this is Chatham House rule, so I'm saying this. But that was all done. But Indian court faces these problems regularly. And I'll give you two examples. The conception of secularism. One by one I'll come. The conception of secularism. Conception of secularism is, everybody knows what is secularism, is very, very clear. Secularism in the West has always meant a separation of church and state. Thomas Jefferson, wall between the church and the state, Chinese wall between the church and the state. But Indian Supreme Court defines it as Sarva Dharma Samabhav or Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti. That's the Indian Supreme Court. If you have to describe secularism for the court, for the public, in an extract from the Upanishad, which clearly means that you could have said it yourself, but it's like you're using a Western term to completely describe an Indian concept. When you sort of incorporate socialism, in the end you say, no, it is Gandhian socialism which is basically Sarvodaya. So again, you describe socialism in Sarvodaya. Sarvodaya is an old Jain, Buddhist sort of term which sort of is structurally for everybody, Bahujan Hitaya cha Bahujan. Sukhaya Bahujan Hitaya. So you incorporate that. When you address equality, which is a very tricky provision in India, because it is tricky, everybody speaks about jati and discrimination based on that. That's a fact, we can't run away from that. The Constitution talks about class, other backward classes. It's the Supreme Court which actually brings in jati, saying caste is class, recognizes it for the first time. Supreme Court has to, because that's the reality of India. When you talk about right to life, if you see the express wordings of the Constitution, it says, the usual framing of right to life, you can't be arrested without, following process, otherwise you can't be put in jail, etc., etc. But the Indian court interprets right to life to mean right to live not beyond mere animal existence. And then incorporates everything into it. So roads, clean water, air, everything. Environment. Now, it comes from a very Indic perspective. I don't think there's any constitution in the world which reads in this amount of rights of people against the government based on only on your right to life. I don't think there's anything. Article 32. Article 32, if you know, Article 32 is right to approach the courts. It is only an Indic court which can say that you have no locus standi, which is unknown in any other. Locus standi means you can be whoever you want to, you can approach the court if there is a legal issue which you want addressed. And the court will not go into to verify. It's a very Indic thing as to the right to approach the king for justice without going through. This is unknown in American jurisprudence. Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence is unknown. This is completely unknown. Though, to be fair, the Constitution allows that in Article 32, but did not know that you will then do away with jurisdiction and do away with locus, and people could write on postcards, and you will then be able to expand it like, people from jail can write on letters, and or like random newspaper articles can be the source of expansion of jurisprudence. So all this, the Indian state, because the Indian judiciary recognizes that. And this is what an entire discussion, and this only, it doesn't happen here, it happens everywhere. It happens in that entire process. Mensky is of the view that codification has harmed people more than non-codification. See, because entire groups in society, jati is a word, whether they were irrespective of religion, used to follow a certain set of customary practices. I don't know how many of you know the Sharia Act in India. Sharia Act was an intervention by the British in the early 1930s, 25, 30s, under the pressure, specifically in terms of the preamble of the Act, under the pressure of the Muslim League to impose Sharia, make Sharia applicable across communities on all Muslims in India, was pushed by Muslims largely, Muslim League largely from UP. But the most interesting thing is, as everybody knows, there's an exception carved for Muslims in UP, saying that no, they will be still governed by their old act because they're estates of the large landholders who pushed for this because the Muslim League was deeply a UP-based party. Because the large landholders wanted succession to be in terms of the old succession rules where the eldest gets it. But if you implemented Sharia, then the division would have been to, in terms of Sharia, everybody gets a portion of it. So they kept that, but they imposed Sharia on everybody else. They sort of codified it. Similarly, there was a great amount of variety in Hindu jurisprudence and in customary in the way we interpreted it. That seems to have gone with Hindu Marriage Act. It has its own intended consequences, unintended consequences. That's not my scope of my. But if we today, now all that being said, if you today want to reverse it, my question is, I don't know whether you'll be able to reverse it. Because for better or for worse, you've agreed to a modern state. If you have to find out something, it's like this discussion why this is important also is if we can find out principles which will govern, you have to find out how would Indian law treat crime, contract, information technology law, biotechnology law. Only then it would be relevant. What are the principles? And that has to be incorporated in judicial thinking under the present structure. Because you can't get rid of the Constitution. The wonderful discussion we may have that, let's throw out the Constitution because it's colonial. That's a wonderful discussion which I can speak about, and when I was young, I would love to hold forth on that. But come on, as we would say in college, come on, seriously. And the process to incorporate it is for this with really serious academic, and the judges read articles. That's how you influence judges. So serious way of going about doing these things is to have serious articles. And that requires serious study. That requires study of people who understand law and who understand tradition, culture, customary practice, Sanskrit, maybe Prakrit also. Not there. As Mensky once told me, he said, Vikram, your biggest disadvantage is you can't read Sanskrit fluently. तो ये सब ज्ञान आप बोलते रहते हो, ठीक है? He told me this. Because he could switch over, he switches to Hindi also. He used to switch his. Well, that's all very nice, but you can't read Sanskrit fluently. तो आप क्या dialogue दे रहे हो? Your knowledge of all this is second hand through English text. So how accurate, how whatever. One of the disadvantages, I think Babasaheb Ambedkar wanted Sanskrit to be national language. We've lost that. I think we should have adopted that. But the knowledge of Sanskrit, like knowledge of Latin, is extremely important in British schools. I think Sanskrit should be taught. I think let people at least have an access to the literature. My disadvantage is I don't understand Sanskrit very well. But to be able to bring this knowledge into the judicial making process is, I'm sorry, I'm not taking too much time, I have to go, is extremely important. And that's the only way to change the system. That requires a lot of hard work and wonderful work which is being done. I think more such has to be done, but on a regular scale, on an organized scale. And it requires work at two levels. One is the work sort of like in old texts, like trying to take out with what is relevant in Manav Dharma Shastra. Then the other point is the moment you study that is, as I said, everything is communal. People go around burning Manusmriti. It's like as stupid goes. And I'm not saying that, I'm not talking about the values. I think every text of a certain date will have certain portions which are not relevant. Even our interpretations are not relevant to the times of the Kal Dharma changes. And I'm a Vivekananda to that extent where he says that not everything in the past was extremely good, so whatever doesn't suit you, discard it. You don't do that for other texts of other religious texts. Now, whether it be canon law, whether it be Sharia, there are portions of it which you violently disagree. That doesn't mean that you discard the baby with the bathwater, but that's the whole question. Maybe that's the whole idea, that you can't have an alternate, doesn't even get in through the door. An alternative can't even get in through the door because it's like you term something racist or you turn something casteist, so that the person can't even have a proper audience. So I think it requires a deeper study. And Manav Dharma Shastra is a text which if you realize seriously, is a text which probably still underlines the way the entire Bharatiya civilization functions from here to Vietnam, to southern Vietnam. And actually text, so it's like the Indonesians don't have a problem because they're now all Muslim now. Or the Burmese don't have a problem because they're Buddhist, so they can refer to Manav Dharma Shastra as part of their text, but here you raise it and hell will break loose. So they can study it, there's no problem, because they're not Muslims, so that's fine. But you can't do it here, because then hell will break loose, you're all communal casteist, etc., etc. So I'm not saying everything is perfect. That's like stupid for me to say that every part of it is correct. And I'm not I'm Bengali Vivekanandite, so I have my reservations about Brahmanism. I have my reservations about how structural orthodoxy can lead to Brahmanism. We have to be very, very conscious about that. Because for better or for worse, we live in a democratic age. You can't again reverse that. So you can't go back to that structure. Being conscious of that, there are wonderful things which have to be looked at, and you incorporate that. But it requires a lot of solid, good work. And a lot of institutions which have worked on it, again, are now stigmatized because they are supposedly come from Brahmin sources and not brought into the mainstream. People went and burnt up Bhandarkar Oriental Institute for being Brahminical. What can one say? So you have to give that access. And it also, and this is a wonderful exercise, because it is also, as Swamiji says, Swami Vivekananda says, it is also the duty of such institutions to ensure that knowledge is disseminated amongst the people so as to lift the people. My criticism against those institutions is not on hierarchic level. My criticism of those institutions is they have been in some ways, maybe because of structure, maybe because the times have been a little exclusive. They have not shared their knowledge as much as they should have. Maybe there weren't enough people willing to listen to them, but it works both ways. So I think this knowledge should be shared more, and this is a wonderful stage which is happening, where people from one knowledge perspective is coming to IITs to share it, which is a much more democratic audience.